there, I'm back. And today we have another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile. If you're new here, welcome to my channel. I'm Leia. If you're not new here, thank you for returning. As often as I can, I do a series called Beauty and the Bibliophile, where I do my makeup and I tell you about the latest book that I've read. If you don't know what a bibliophile is, it's a lover and a collector of books. That's me. Today's book is Never, Never, The Tale of Captain Hook. And it is the 9th book in the Villains series by Serena Valentino. And this came out in 2022. Now, spoiler alerts. If you are thinking about reading this book and you don't want to know anything about it, do not watch this video because you will know the ending. If you're just thinking about reading the book or you don't want to read the book but you still want to know the story, then this would be a good video for you. Also, while I do this summary, I'm going to assume that you have seen the movie Peter Pan, the animated one, the real one. If you haven't, I'd strongly suggest watching that first before listening to this video or reading this book, because if you haven't, you're not gonna understand a whole lot going on. Also, this is just one book in a series of books, so if you haven't seen my videos on those books, you should probably watch those first two again, otherwise you're gonna be lost. So yeah, if that all sounds good to you, then yeah, let's get started. All right, so Never, Never, The Tale of Captain Hook. And this came out in 2022. Also, if you're curious about any of the products that I'm using, they will be listed in the description box below. So this story starts with the Odd Sisters speaking. Hopefully you remember them. And they say that Captain Hook would like it known that he is the bravest man who has ever flown a pirate flag. But they know the truth. They say that they are very powerful witches, the creator of fates, and the author of the fairy tale book that we are reading at this very moment. And if you remember, they, from the last book, are still trapped in the place between. The place between the land of the living and beyond the veil. They also remind us that their daughter, Circe, had just sacrificed herself to save the many kingdoms. I'm going to let my skincare sit for a few minutes before we move on to makeup. But never mind that for now. This story is about Captain James Hook. They say he wasn't always the cowardly grown-up pirate that he is today. He had actually been born in London before the time of Lady Tremaine or Cruella, but he also had a similar upbringing. He was born to an aristocratic family, and like most high society families back then, James had a nurse, and she would take him out on a walk every day. One of these days, she had to turn her attention away from him for just a moment. Then when she turned back, he was no longer in his pram. Pram is a fancy word for a stroller. James was missing for 6 days. And of course, his parents were completely panicked looking for him. The Odd Sisters also say that for some reason in London, when a boy falls out of his pram, he is transported to Neverland. And if he's not claimed within 7 days, then he's trapped in Neverland forever and he becomes a lost boy. Now, maybe this makes no sense to you and me, but to the Odd Sisters, it makes perfect sense. Because who else would care for a bunch of little boys who went missing? The fairies had no time. Their attention was devoted to, for the most part, young girls. And the witches didn't have time for grubby little boys. So that is why the Fairy Council sent one of their more unruly fairies, Tinkerbell, to Neverland to care for the boys. James's time in Neverland was far more appealing to him than his life in London. He would have stayed there for the rest of his life if his mother hadn't found him and brought him home. And his memory of Neverland began to consume him, and it became an obsession for him to figure out how to get back. When he got older, he did everything he could to learn as much as he could about Neverland. But the most he could find on it were children's fairy tales. But then he found some books on pirates in his father's library. He became very intrigued by their stories of their adventures to distant and magical lands. But of course, James's parents would never allow him to be a pirate. They were raising him to become a proper gentleman, and they were sending him to the most high-end, expensive schools. And when he graduated, he was expected to get married to a girl of means. Like a lot of titled families, they were greatly financially burdened by a large estate. So instead of stooping to working, they were going to marry off their son to a wealthy woman. But James's mind was set to become a pirate. So while he was at school, he took the opportunity to learn as much as he could about pirates. He familiarized himself with all the skills that a pirate would need: artillery, rigging, knowledge of navigation, and of course, skullduggery and the dastardly deeds of famous pirates. And the more that he learned about pirates, the more he became convinced that these were the people that could probably find Neverland if it was at all possible. Now, James's adventure began on the night that he graduated. The butler found a farewell note to his parents explaining that he was off to become a pirate, and his parents were shocked and horrified. But the butler knew this was what James really wanted. He had known James since he was a little boy and was very close to him. After he left his parents' hangout, he went straight to a tavern where he knew a bunch of pirates visited often, hung out at, and it was called the Crusty Toad. So he puts on his best, what he thought his best pirate outfit, and he goes down there and he sits at a table. He was hoping he could possibly befriend some pirates and get on somebody's crew. And everyone's looking at him like, ugh, who's this pretty high society boy, not taking him seriously at all. Now the butler, whose name was Mr. Smee, he knew James very well, and he decided to track him down and talk some sense into him and make him go back home. So he finds him at the Crusty Toad, but James was not having it. And then a pirate named Blackbeard hears James and Mr. Smee's conversation, and he sees something in James that reminds him of himself, and so he invites James to join his crew. But before he could take him on as a crew member, he did have to test his pirate knowledge first a little, and he asks him, he's like, what is the skull and crossbones that's on the flags of ships like mine? What's it called? And James tells him, oh, it's called the Jolly Roger. And he elaborates a little. He's like, you know, there's a lot of debate on how it got its name, but I think that it's derived from the term Old Roger, which is an old way of saying Hades, like a slang term. And Blackbeard liked this answer. He smiled, and he was all about him joining his crew. He really felt like he would bring something. But he was also curious as to why someone like James with his background would even want to be a pirate. So we asked him, and James just kind of blurted out that he wanted to find Neverland. And Blackbeard thought that was a strange answer, but an acceptable one. The only thing that James also had to do, according to Blackbeard, was get a real pirate's name. So Blackbeard decided to make him his bosun, I think is how you say it. It's the person that's in charge of the equipment and the crew, kind of like a manager. Blackbeard also told him, he's like, hey, if you're gonna bring your butler along, you better get him some proper attire. Now James was ecstatic. Not only did he get on a crew, he got on the famous Blackbeard's crew, and he'd be sailing the 7 seas on his ship, the Silent Wraith. Smee agreed reluctantly to go with James. Smee had always taken a fatherly interest in James, and he was worried about him going off on these new adventures, and he felt, you know, he wanted to go along to protect him. Smee always was gonna look at James like that same little boy who fell out of his pram. And James told Smee, he's like, you know, you don't have to come. But Smee felt like if anything ever happened to James, he couldn't forgive himself. Now, after about a year at sea, enough time for James to have gotten comfortable in his position, their ship got attacked by a kraken, which is like a giant squid. And during the battle, James and Blackbeard fell into the water. Now, James tried to rescue Blackbeard, but he started feeling like his lungs seizing. He had followed Blackbeard down into the water far too far down to make it back to the surface in time. And James was obviously sad because, not because he was about to drown, because his story was kind of over before it got properly started. So with his heart full of regret, he let out his final breath and everything went black. Now when he came to, he was still underwater and he couldn't understand how he was able to still be breathing. He looked around for his friend Blackbeard, but he couldn't see him anywhere. All he could see lying on the ocean floor, which a bunch of wreckage from ships that had sunk. Then he heard a high-pitched voice say, "Over here! Your friend's over here!" James looked and he saw a siren, which is like a half fish, half person, not like a mermaid. This is very different. It's shaped like the face of a human, but the eyes are like very bulbous, like a fish. And she had gills on the sides of her face. And then her body was shaped very much like a human, except that it had like golden scales all over. And her hands and feet were webbed. Her mouth was very wide, like an angular fish. And she had several rows of sharp teeth. And, you know, James would have actually been pretty frightened of this creature if it didn't seem like she was trying to help him. Then she's like, "Come quickly." And he can see her trying to rouse Blackbeard on the ocean floor. James couldn't tell if he was dead or not. So he tries to like move him, get him to get going. And then all of a sudden the siren is like, "Oh, we have to get out of here. He's coming." And James is like, "Ooh, who's coming?" He's like, "I can't leave my captain here." And the siren swims off. James is still trying to like pull at Blackbeard. He's way too heavy. There's no way he can swim him to the surface. James is thinking to himself, he's like, and he's saying to Blackbeard, he's like, "Come on." He's like, "Come on, get up." He's like, "This isn't our fate." Then he hears an anonymous voice say, "But this is your fate, James. This is where the dead come so they may be led to their final resting place." James looked around but could see no one. And James is like, "Oh, I won't let you take him." And the voice is like, "Well, okay, well then I'll just have to take you both, I guess." And James is like, "But I can't die. This isn't the end of my tale." James felt like he was dreaming or something. None of this seemed real. And then the voice is like, "Well, you know what they say about dead men." The voice is laughing and James is like, "You show yourself." Then a massive ship materialized out of the darkness. The ship looked both dead and alive, like the skeletal remains of a once beautiful ship. The deck was populated by hundreds or thousands of seafaring men and women who had lost their lives at sea. It was the Flying Dutchman. James was sure of it. He had read all about it, but he thought it was just a legend. And standing at the helm was its captain, Davy Jones. He was the deity that shuttles souls who have died at sea to their final resting place. Now, James was praying that he survived this situation. And then Davy Jones says, I am bound by the Greek goddess Calypso to shuttle those who have died at sea to the underworld. He's like, will you go peacefully, or are you going to make it more interesting and put up a fight? Then all of a sudden, Blackbeard says, we're going to put up a fight. And James is like, Captain, you're alive. And Blackbeard is like, well, you could say that. He's like, James, no matter what, stand your ground. Then Blackbeard let out a harrowing howl, and the whole ocean seemed to come alive. The water started to swirl all around them, and it had such force that the ships that were wrecked at the bottom of the sea started to be pulled up into this water vortex that was forming around them. And Davy Jones is like, oh, I see you have great goddesses at your disposal as well. He's like, shouldn't we see whose are stronger? And Blackbeard's like, give us your worst, you devils. And all of a sudden, a bunch of pirate ghosts come swarming and bearing down on James and Blackbeard. James closes his eyes and he braces himself for the sting of death. Then all of a sudden, a bright light emerges from Blackbeard's hand, and he's holding this golden, shiny tinderbox, and it erupts like a star, and it sends everything around them careening backwards, and it shoots Blackbeard and James straight up and through the water surface into the air. James was so frightened, he was holding on to Blackbeard as they went flying through the air and then smacked back down on the water. James sees Blackbeard a few feet away, and he's unconscious and he's starting to fall back down under the water. So James, he swims over there and he pushes him up onto some debris from their ship, from the battle with the Kraken. Pushes them up there, and then he sees their ship coming towards them, and the crew is able to get James and Blackbeard and pull them up onto deck. So on deck, Blackbeard was able to catch his breath and gather himself. And James is looking around for Smee. He was worried. He was like, Smee, are you okay? Where are you? And he yells out, aye, aye, Captain. So Blackbeard obviously is not feeling great. So he goes off into his private quarters. So a few moments later, James and Smee, they go into his quarters to check on him. And they see him like picking up a bunch of like items that had fallen on the floor and putting them into a little wooden chest with an eye carved onto it. And Blackbeard asks James, he's like, is everyone accounted for? And he says, yes, everyone's fine. And he's like, and what about my ship? How is it doing? And James is like, well, we'll be lucky if we can even get her to a floating boneyard. And Blackbeard's like, oh, that bad, huh? James is like, I'm afraid so. And Blackbeard, he accepts it, and he's like, well, so be it then. Then Blackbeard, he puts his arm around James, and he's like, I owe you my life. And James is like, no. He's like, I owe you mine. If it wasn't for you and your little magical tinderbox there, we never would have made it out alive. And Blackbeard is like, well, what makes you think we made it out alive? James thought he always did have a dark sense of humor. Then Blackbeard picks up the wooden chest with the carving of the eye on it, and he hands it to James, and he's like, "This is yours now. I'm giving this to you." He's like, "But let me tell you all about it." Now in the corner of the mini worlds, there are floating boneyards where ships go to die or await to be reborn. Now, Blackbeard wanted to take the Silent Wraith to one particular boneyard for her final rest. So when they get there, he carefully sails the Silent Wraith up to this other ship. And James thinks it's very beautiful. It's red and gold, and its Jolly Roger flag is blowing in the wind. And Blackbeard's like, "This is the Jolly Roger, isn't she beautiful?" And Blackbeard goes on that, she was cursed by 3 witches as he sailed her away from their shores. They said the only way to break the curse was to give her to someone who had saved his life, and that was James. He said that she belonged to him now, and so did his crew. And James couldn't believe it. Blackbeard told him that he would make a fine captain, that his time had come to an end. Then he took something out of the box with the eye on it. Blackbeard is like, "I want you to have this." He's like, "I found it in a distant magical land called the Mini Kingdoms." And he hands him the chest and a rolled up piece of parchment. And it's a map to the Mini Kingdoms. He's like, "I know it's not your beloved Neverland, but it is a magical land." He's like, "If you seek out the 3 most powerful witches there, I'm sure they can help you get to Neverland." He's like, "But you have to tell them that I gave you my ship in order for me to be released from the curse." He's like, "But be careful, because there is always a price with the Odd Sisters." And James is like, "The Odd Sisters?" He's like, "These are the witches that cursed your ship?" He's like, "Yep, the very ones." He's like, "But you're a lot smarter than I was at your age. You won't fall for their little tricks." He's like, "Just make sure you only do what they ask of you for the information that you want." He's like, "And don't lie to them, and don't steal anything from them." He's like, "They will know." He's like, "That was my mistake." He's like, "And don't worry about the curse on the ship. It's not going to affect you. Since I gave it to someone who saved my life, it won't affect you." He's like, "The witches are treacherous, but they keep their word for good or bad." He's like, and you'll think these witches, they'll help me find Neverland?" He's like, "Yeah, I think they will." He's like, "And how will I know these witches?" And Blackbeard's like, "Oh," he's like, "you'll know them when you see them. Besides, they'll seek you out as soon as you hit Morningstar shores." And James is like, "Okay." He's like, "But honestly, I'm kind of frightened." And Blackbeard was like, "Oh, that's okay." He says that this journey will bring you closer to your goal. And that is always frightening, because realizing one's dreams can be a terrifying venture, for fear that they don't meet one's expectations. And James is like, "Oh, are you sure I'm ready?" He's like, "Won't you come with me to the Mini Kingdoms?" And Blackbeard, he's like, "No, unfortunately, I'm banned from there." He's like, "But I know you're ready, James." He's like, "You saved me, and you saved all these men, and they'll follow you anywhere, even Neverland." He's like, "The only thing that I ask of you is that you get yourself a proper pirate's name already." Now, after several months of travel, they finally made it to Morningstar Kingdom. And as they're pulling into the harbor, they see a beautiful Cyclopean castle, and it's surrounded by these magical golden flowers that gleamed and glowed. Now, Skylights, one of the crew members, he had traveled the Mini Kingdoms with Blackbeard, and he told James that these flowers weren't always in this kingdom. When they had been there, you could only find them in a place called the Dead Woods. But that was before the Odd Sisters claimed the Dead Woods as their home. Then he noticed a crow circling above them, and Skylights knew that this crow belonged to the Dark Fairy. And he tells him that the Dark Fairy can change herself into a dragon whenever she wants and destroy the many kingdoms. And Blackbeard's like, okay, dragons, okay. And Skylight's like, no, it's true. He's like, it's all in the book of fairy tales that Blackbeard has in that chest. Now, Blackbeard had told him not to open the chest until he was well far away from the many kingdoms. He told him that the Odd Sisters would do anything to get their hands on it. And James wasn't going to open it. He was not going to betray his friend. But he did like knowing that he had something that the Odd Sisters might want and that he might be able to leverage. Just then, the crow that had been circling them swoops down, and he has a little message tied to his foot, and it's for James. And it's the Odd Sisters, and they're inviting him to tea in the Dead Woods that evening. And they tell him, you know, on your way, pick up a cake. And James is like, okay. He's like, how powerful can these witches be if they can't even conjure themselves a cake? Now, it was a bit of a journey by horse-drawn carriage from Morningstar Kingdom to the Dead Woods. But luckily, he was able to find a little bakery by a silly name called Mr. Butterpants and Mrs. Tittlebottom's Bakery. Now, when he arrived at the Dead Woods, it was surrounded by a thicket of thorny red rose bushes. Now, he had heard the place was dried and dead and thorny, but this thicket was beautiful with blooming roses that were a gorgeous shade of red, and it looked nothing like the place that Skylights had described. He didn't really understand why they called it the Dead Woods. He couldn't find an entrance, though, and he was starting to think maybe he was in the wrong place. Then all of a sudden, an opening appeared right in front of him in the thicket, and the most luminescent woman walked through the entrance. Her hair was long and golden, and she wore a silver dress. She's like, hello, James. She's like, I'm Cersei, and you are most welcome here. She's like, please come in. And she motions for him to walk through the little opening. And she walks him through the most beautiful grounds that James had ever seen. And it was full of those magical glowing flowers everywhere. And they cast like a golden glow up onto a stone mansion. I'm going to be using an appropriate palette. And as they're walking, Cersei says, she's like, you know, this used to be a dreary place full of gloom, but it doesn't need to stay that way. And she led him up to that stone mansion. And James says, he's like, I think a lot must have changed around here since Blackbeard was here last. He's like, it's nothing like how it was described to me. And Cersei's like, yes, you're right. A lot has changed since he visited here last. Then, all of a sudden, 2 other women joined them. And James did not understand why Blackbeard had been so fearful of these women. He's like, they didn't seem frightful at all. They seemed perfectly lovely. They were nothing like how he described. They didn't even look alike, like he said. And then Cersei, she's like, these are my aunts, Hazel and Primrose, and they rule by my side here in the Dead Woods. And James is like, you know, someone told me that you were frightful witches with raven hair and stark white, frightful faces. And Cersei, Primrose, and Hazel, they start laughing, which kind of surprised James. And Cersei's like, oh, I think you're mistaking us for my mothers. And James is like, oh, sorry. And Cersei's like, oh, she's laughing. She's like, don't worry. She's like, my mothers have been described far worse. She's like, shall we go inside and have some cake? And then this wraith of a man, basically just a skeleton, comes in and he takes the cake from James and brings it inside. And Cersei is like, oh, this is our grandfather, Sir Jacob. Remember Sir Jacob? And James is like, so how long has it been since your mother's passed away? And Cersei's like, oh, they have been away so long that they would not even recognize the many kingdoms anymore. She's like, so many things have changed since the breaking of the worlds. And Cersei, she explains to him that, my mothers aren't passed away. They're neither living nor dead. She explains to him that they're in a place between worlds where they can't do any more harm. James is like, what do you mean by breaking of the worlds? And Cersei explains to him that, long ago there was a fourth odd sister, and she was very much cherished by Cersei's mothers. They doted on her and loved her more than they loved themselves. But one day, the dark fairy, in a fit of rage, set the fairylands on fire, accidentally killing their sister. She told him that her mothers were so desperate to get her back that they devised a spell to try and recreate her by sacrificing the better parts of themselves. And by doing this, they created a new Cersei, but only in the original Cersei's image. That spell took away the better parts of their nature. Everything that was good about them was now in their daughter. And in time, the odd sisters' sacrifice drove them insane and drove them to do terrible things, trying to destroy the many kingdoms. And they spread heartbreak and destruction through the many worlds. And Cersei explains that that daughter that they created was her. Then Hazel explains that Cersei had to sacrifice herself in order for her mothers to be whole again. But the odd sisters weren't going to have that, so with the help of a god, they were able to force Cersei out of the place between, causing the worlds to break, and once again shattering the odd sisters apart again. So now Cersei is here in the dead woods, repairing all the damage that her mothers have done throughout the many kingdoms. And her mothers are still trapped in the place between. And James is like, well, is that why the many kingdoms are covered in those magical flowers? You used those magical flowers to repair the worlds? And Cersei said, yes, that's exactly right. She's like, I can see why my mothers wanted us to meet you so badly, the famous pirate that broke Blackbeard's curse. James was still confused why the odd sisters wanted him to bring cake, because they weren't even there. Maybe it was just to mess with him? Anyway, finally they go into this room that's completely constructed of glass, and there's a gorgeous view of the dead woods, and as far as they can see are tombs and crypts, and those glowing flowers are everywhere. And James thinks it's truly beautiful. And James is like, well, for whatever reason, the odd sisters wanted me to come here. He's like, I don't know why, but I'm very happy to have met you ladies. And Cersei's like, honestly, we doubted that you would ever come. The odd sisters insisted that you would, once Blackbeard gifted you his ship. She's like, my mother's cursed Blackbeard with the inability to rest either in life or in death. It was his punishment for stealing their treasures. And James is like, what do you mean? And Cersei's like, he lived an extraordinarily long life, and the whole time he couldn't sleep at night or ever. And no matter how mortally wounded he was, he could never die. And she's like, I hope he's finally at rest. And James is like, maybe I'm not clear on how magic works, but why would I have to come here to tell the odd sisters that Blackbeard had given me his ship? Wouldn't the curse have just lifted once he did. And Cersei's like, well, they must have wanted you to come here for some reason, else they wouldn't have made it part of the deal. They wouldn't have made it part of Blackbeard's payment. Then Primrose says to James, she's like, you know, I know you're here in hopes of getting to Neverland, but I'm afraid it's not going to be the way you remembered. I'm afraid you're not going to find the life that you're looking for there. And James is taken aback. He's a little offended. His dreams are becoming crushed all of a sudden. And he's like, well, how do you know that? And Primrose is like, because it's been written. It's your fate. It's in the book of fairy tales. And James is like, well, I don't believe you. And Hazel's like, I mean, it's okay. She's like, we can help you change your fate. And he's like, well, how do you know what's written in the book of fairy tales anyway? It's been locked away in Blackbeard's chest. And Cersei says, because the queens of the dead have been the authors of that book since the very first queens started writing in it. She's like, those stories are inscribed on our souls. And she's like, but you have nothing to fear from us, James. She's like, but, you know, we kind of would like the book back. And James is like, well, I was going to use it to tempt your mothers into helping me get to Neverland. He's like, are you going to offer me the same deal? And Primrose is like, you don't need to bargain with us. She's like, please heed our warning. Don't go to Neverland. She's like, going there is going to set you on a path that the Odd Sisters have already predestined. And she's like, you know, we'll help you find Neverland if you insist on it, but could you just please heed our warnings? And James is like, well, this is nonsense. I've never heard anything like this. He's like, I don't believe you. I've wanted nothing more my entire life. It's my fondest wish. And Cersei kind of looks at him and she's like, are you sure that's your fondest wish? And James is like, won't you just please show me the way to Neverland? You know, James, he liked these ladies of the Dead Woods, but he was starting to wonder if he should just take this up with the Odd Sisters. And Hazel is like, you know, we can offer you a better life here. But, you know, again, if you insist on going, we'll show you the way. And despite our warnings, we will give you what you need to get to Neverland. She's like, but the rest is on you. She's like, you sure you're not going to heed our warnings? But James wouldn't. He was set on going to Neverland. So Primrose is like, okay, fine. She's like, we can't keep you from Neverland if that's what you truly want. But in exchange, we want the box with the eye on it. The one that Blackbeard gave you. And James is like, okay. He's like, so I'll give you this box. And you'll show me the way to Neverland? And Hazel, she's like, yes. Bring us the box and we will enchant your ship so that it can fly to Neverland. She's like, meet us at Morning Star Harbor tomorrow morning to make the exchange. And Cersei's like, we do have one final request though, and that's do not open the box. And James is like, he's like, no problem. He's like, Blackbeard already told me not to. And Primrose is like, okay, well, wonderful. She's like, everything's set then. Why don't we have some of this delicious cake? And when he got back to the ship, he went to his quarters and the box was sitting on a table and it was starting to shudder and move around and tremble. And he looks at it and he's remembering, you know, Cersei and Blackbeard's warning not to open it. So he puts his ear to it and he realizes he can hear voices. He like quickly steps away from it. He's like watching it like move about and tremble. And it's moving around so much that it falls to the floor and it bursts open. Now lying on the floor along with some other ornate objects was a very beautiful decorated hand mirror. And in the mirror is a frightful looking woman looking back at James. She says, oh, hello, James. She's like, I'm Lucinda. I'm Cersei's mother. She's like, I see you've already betrayed Cersei and Blackbeard by opening the box. He grabs all the items that fell out and he puts them back in the box and slams the lid shut and backs away. He's like, I didn't open the box, you did, by making it fall on the ground. He's like, what do you want? And Lucinda is like, oh no, that's the question that I have for you, James. What is it that you truly want? He's like, I already told your daughter I want to go to Neverland. And they're like, okay. They're like, take this box and sell its content to this little shop in Eaton Square. All of it except for the hand mirror and the iron clock. And we'll send you to Neverland. And he's like, well, I already made that deal with Cersei. She's sending me to Neverland. And Lucinda is like, oh, she's like, and you're sure she'll keep this promise? And James is like, well, Cersei doesn't seem like a liar to me. He's like, I'm sure she'll keep her promise. He's like, I can't say the same for you, though. He's like, I'm not so sure you would keep a promise. And Lucinda's like, I have no intention of breaking a promise to you. She's like, I'm like, Cersei, I want you to go to Neverland. She's like, I want you to go to Neverland because I want you to bring Tinkerbell back to me. And if you do this, I will give you your true wish. Well, now James understood their true motivations for wanting him to go to Neverland. And he's like, well, what do you want with Tinkerbell? Now he knew who Tinkerbell was because she was in all of Peter Pan's stories that he read as a kid. And Lucinda says, oh, she belongs in the many kingdoms. She's like, a long time ago, her own kind sent her away to Neverland, and she's been lost and lonely there ever since. We simply just want to bring her home. And Lucinda's like, if you do this, we will give you the magic fairy dust that you need to get to Neverland. But we only have enough to get you there. In order to come back to give us Tinkerbell, you're going to have to use Tinkerbell's magic dust. Like if you don't, you'll be trapped in Neverland forever. Now the idea of being trapped in Neverland didn't sound like such a bad idea to James. That's actually what he wanted. And he still didn't see why he should make a deal with Lucinda instead of just keeping the deal that he already made with Cersei. Now Lucinda, remember, she can read minds. And she tells him that she has the power to grant him his true wish, his secret wish. He's like, you do? You can do that? He's like, okay. He's like, if you can give me my greatest wish, my secret wish that nobody else knows, then I'll do what you want. And she's like, okay, good. She's like, go back to London and sell those items in the box, the ones we told you to, and then we will tell you where you can find the magic that will get you to Neverland. She's like, but you know, those items in that box, they're cursed, so better do it sooner than later. And then her face disappeared from the magic mirror. So James, he sails back to London and he goes to that little curiosity shop in Eaton Square, the same one where Lady Tremaine's husband bought her the brooch and where Cruella's father bought her the earrings. And he sells it all except for the hand mirror and the iron clock. And while he's there, he sees that the shopkeeper has a beautiful red captain's coat. And he buys it for himself out of the money that he gets for the treasures. Now when he gets back to the ship, he calls Lucinda on the magic mirror, like she had instructed him to, so that he can tell her that he was, you know, done with his business at the shop. And he says to her, he's like, you know, I understand why you want me to keep the mirror, but why did you want me to keep the clock? And Lucinda's like, well, to keep track of time, of course. Then Lucinda notices the red captain's coat that James is wearing, and she tells him to reach into his pocket. And he does. And he finds a little vial of sparkly golden dust. And she tells him that this is the magic that's going to get him to Neverland. And to use it, all he has to do is pour some into his hand, blow it into the sails, and the magic would fly him to Neverland. And all he has to do is head for the second store on the right and straight on till morning. So that's what he does. Pours some into his hand, he blows it up towards the sail, and the sparkling magic flies through the wind, and then it lifts the ship up into the sky. And it's finally happening. James is finally going to the realm beyond the stars. And well before he knew it, it was morning, and they had made it to Neverland. And they landed the ship near a lagoon where James could see where the Lost Boys and Peter were playing. And he gets off the ship and he's like, "Hello, my friends, I'm finally back home." And Peter's like, "Away with you, pirate." And James is like, "Peter, don't you remember me?" And Peter's like, he's like, "I'm not in the habit of making friends with pirates." Then Tinkerbell whispers into Peter's ear. And then Peter says, "James, is that you?" He's like, "I didn't even recognize you." He's like, "You're so old." And he's laughing. And then one of the Lost Boys is like, "You can't trust him. He's an adult." And James, he couldn't understand why his old friends were acting this way. Then Smee speaks up. And he's like, "Oh, you can trust Master James." He's like, "In fact, we're having a grand party 3 days from now. And you're all invited." He's like, "We're gonna have music and dancing and food and games." And Peter's like, "Food and games, you say?" And James is like, "Oh yes, the most delicious food you've ever tasted." And Peter's like, "And chocolate cake? Will there be chocolate cake?" And of course, James is like, "Oh, absolutely. It's gonna be a grand time and you're all invited." And Peter's like, "Okay." He's like, "Yeah, we'll come." And James turns to Tinkerbell. He's like, "Oh, and Tinkerbell, we really hope you will join us as well." Now, Smee had provided James with the perfect situation to capture Tinkerbell, but James needed to be careful because he didn't want Peter to know that he was at all involved in Tinkerbell's disappearance. Now, James's plan was to lace a beautiful chocolate cake with a bunch of sleeping draft. They had a ton of it in the kitchen because Blackbeard was always trying to use it to break his curse. Since he could never sleep, it never worked, but so they had a ton of it. James thought, "Oh, Peter will never know. While everyone is asleep, they'll use Tinkerbell's magic to get them to the many kingdoms so he could deliver Tinkerbell to Lucinda. And then they'd have enough time to get back, and then they would pretend like they had been asleep the whole time and have no idea where Tinkerbell was either." So he put Smee to work getting ready for the party. And to distract himself, he decided to go explore Neverland a little bit. And he runs in to the mermaids at Mermaid Lagoon near Skull Rock. And they're like, "Oh, so you found your way back to Neverland. We wondered if you'd ever make it back." But I guess Peter was right. Now, it didn't seem like the mermaids were too happy to see James. He didn't understand why nobody in Neverland was happy to see him. He had nothing but good memories with all these people. And James was like, "What do you mean?" And the mermaids are like, "Ugh, we remember you crying when you were here, when your mother came and claimed you. Like, it was terrible and it hurt my ears. We were so glad when your mother finally found you." And they were like, "But your crying was nothing compared to hers. We could hear her all the way from the Labyrinth of Longing." And James was like, "What are you talking about? What is this labyrinth?" And the mermaids kind of like ignore his question and they're like, what are you doing here, James? She's like, Peter and the Lost Boys are never going to want to be friends with you. They're never going to trust you because you're an adult. And James was like, well, I'll show Peter that I can be trusted. I'll show him that we can be friends. And the mermaids start laughing and they're like, is that what you think you're doing here? Making friends. They're like, you have no friends here, James, and no way home. Maybe you can find your way back home through the labyrinth. It's like if you listen closely, you can hear all the mothers crying and calling for their lost sons. And James is like, well, where is this place? And the mermaids are like, you should remember, James. That's how your mother found you so many years ago. It's hidden, of course, because Peter doesn't want the Lost Boys wandering in there and being claimed by their mothers. And James is like, well, then why was I allowed to wander in there? And the mermaids are like, that's a question for Peter. So he's frustrated. So he goes back to his ship and he's thinking, you know, even though nobody likes me here, I'm going to focus on what's important. And that's that I'm back in Neverland. And soon he would have what he truly wanted, friends. Now the day of the party, Smee had outdone himself. There was baked chicken, loaves of bread, candy, cookies, fruit covered in chocolate, sugar cookies, lemon curd, and of course, a huge chocolate cake. And placed in the center of the table was the Odd Sisters' iron clock, so that James could keep track of how long the sleeping draft was working. Now when Peter arrived, he landed on the deck right next to James, and he's like, hello, pirate. And James is like, oh, well, welcome, Peter. He's like, where are the Lost Boys and Tinkerbell? And Peter ignores his question. He's like, are you happy, James? He's like, I've been talking with the mermaids, and they say you're not happy. And James is like, oh, you know mermaids, I'm sure they were just teasing. Then Peter puts his fingers in his mouth and he lets out a huge whistle and he yells, come on, Lost Boys, it's not a trap. And they all come running up onto the deck and they swarm the banquet table. And James notices that Tinkerbell is not with them. Now when the Lost Boys saw the chocolate cake, they started swarming it and started eating it with just their hands. And Smee was barely able to cut 2 pieces and put them on plates and bring them over to Peter and James. So then James asks Peter, he's like, where's your little fairy friend? And Peter's like, oh, she's over talking to the mermaids. And he yells out to her, he's like, Tink, Tink. He's like, come have some cake. And when she flies over, James is like, oh, hello, Tinkerbell. I'm so glad you've joined us. And she's just kind of like glaring at James with her hands on her hips. So James, he tries to distract Peter from Tinkerbell. He's like, you know, Peter, I've always wondered, why are there no lost girls, only lost boys? And Peter's like, oh, that's because girls are far too clever to fall out of their prams. Then Smee shows up with Tinkerbell's little cake. And Tinkerbell, she kind of like snips it, and then she wrinkles her nose at it, and she stamps her feet, and she points angrily at Smee. She was onto them, but Peter and the Lost Boys were already starting to fall asleep on their feet. So Tinkerbell starts flying from Peter and each of the Lost Boys, trying to like wake them up, but they were all already fast asleep. Then one of the crew members up in the crow's nest dropped a net onto Tinkerbell, trapping her. Then something happened that James was not expecting. A brethren of crocodiles started circling the ship, and one of the crocodiles seemed to only have eyes for James. Now the mermaids got curious about what was going on, and they swam over. When they looked around and saw Peter and the Lost Boys all fast asleep, they realized what was going on. So they started helping the crocodiles circle the ship and kind of push it and rock it back and forth so that James was losing his footing, but he was able to make his way over to Tinkerbell and grab her out of the net and kind of hold her in his fist. Then suddenly James realized he didn't see Peter anywhere, and he was afraid that he must have fallen overboard from all the rocking. Then he heard Peter's voice behind him. He's like, "You let her go or I'll have your head." And he turns around and there's Peter with a sword. Now as James held Tinkerbell in his fist tightly, he fought off Peter with his other hand. And he's thinking to himself, man, everything has gone terribly wrong. This is not what he wanted. He had ruined everything. And he could see it in Peter's eyes. James had wanted so badly to be friends with him, but it seemed like now he was his enemy. Then, all of a sudden, James feels nothing but pain. Pain in his hand that shot up through him like lightning. And the pain was so great he thought he was gonna pass out. And he looks and he sees his severed hand flying through the air, still clutching Tinkerbell. And then James falls overboard, plummeting towards the water. And James is thinking again, he's like, this doesn't seem real. In fact, nothing had seemed real since the battle with the Kraken. As he flew closer to the water, he could see that one crocodile waiting for him. But before James hit the water, the Jolly Roger, steered by Smee, I think, swooped in and caught him before he went into the crocodile's mouth. But James's hand wasn't so lucky. And Peter, he yells, "Tinkerbell!" And he goes diving into the water after the crocodile. And James was wondering, did the crocodile eat Tinkerbell along with his hand? And that's the last thing that he remembers. Now, James woke several days later and he found that he had a hook for a hand and that he was Peter Pan's mortal enemy. Smee had managed to find a great hiding place for the crew, somewhere the Lost Boys would never go, and that was the Labyrinth of Longing. And the first thing that James said when he woke up, he's like, "Is Tinkerbell still alive?" And Smee said, "Yes, I believe that she is." Then Lucinda calls him on the magic mirror, and she tells him that, you know what, now that crocodile, he has a taste for your blood. She's like, "But at least you'll hear him coming now because he ate our clock as well." And James is like, "You never intended to give me my fondest wish, did you?" It's like, "I should have listened to Cersei." And Lucinda's like, "Yeah, you should have, because Cersei, she's bound by the truth, but I am not." And James is like, "So I'm trapped here forever?" He's like, "All this was for nothing?" And Lucinda's like, "Oh, it wasn't for nothing." She's like, "If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't have gotten the brooch and the earrings and our treasures and the fairy tale book into the mortal world." Then all of a sudden, Cersei appears in the mirror. And James is like, "Oh, Cersei." He's like, "I'm so sorry." He's like, "How am I ever going to get home?" He's like, "This isn't how it's supposed to happen. Lucinda promised that she would make me a lost boy." And Cersei's like, "Well, Peter's the only one that can grant that wish." And Jason's like, "Well, why didn't you just tell me that in the beginning? I would have just gone to Peter and asked him." He's like, "All I ever wanted was to be his friend." And Cersei's like, she's like, "I couldn't bring myself to break your heart." She's like, "Peter never wanted you to be a lost boy. He was the one that made sure that you wandered into the Labyrinth of Longing and were claimed by your mother. He is the reason you were sent away from Neverland." She's like, "I wish you had just met us in Morning Star Harbor and made the exchange, I could have enchanted your ship and sent you anywhere you desired. And James is like, well, can you do that now? Can you enchant my ship so I can get to the many kingdoms or back to London? And she's like, well, I wish I could, but the only way you can do that is with Tinkerbell's pixie dust. And James is like, ugh, well, I guess I'm stuck here forever, just like I wished. It's like I'm stuck listening to the crying of mothers endlessly searching for their sons. And Cersei's like, oh, she's like, well, what happens if the mothers find their sons? And James is like, well, they take them home, of course. And Cersei's like, no, James, wait. But it's too late. He puts down the mirror and he runs off. So he goes into the labyrinth of longing. And inside there's all these ghostly women and dressed in black pushing empty prams. And every time they see him, they look up with hope. And then they realize that's not their son and they're back to despair. Now James thinks he finally figured out how this labyrinth worked. These ghostly women were the personifications of these mothers' grief. A grief so intense that it has to live outside the body and becomes its own entity. He doubts that, his own mother remembers this, and he attributes that to just, the magic of Neverland. So he searches the labyrinth for hours and hours, calling out his mother's name again and again, hoping that she would find him this time as well. But she never answered, and he kind of lost hope, and he sits down crying. Then James sees Peter Pan escorting a little boy into the labyrinth. And he's saying to the little boy, he's like, yes, he's like, just go run off that way. He's like, your mother will find you. And James, he says, oh, he's like, I'm surprised to see you in the labyrinth, kind of scaring Peter. He's like, aren't you afraid of becoming claimed? And Peter smiles and he says, neither of our mothers are here, James. He's like, they are both well past living. And James remembers, he's like, oh yeah, time works different in these lands. He had been in Neverland for so long that his mother was dead now. And he asks Peter, he's like, why did you turn me away, Peter? Why didn't you want me to be a lost boy? Why wasn't I good enough? And Peter is like, because what we needed was a pirate. Someone to make our adventures more exciting. And he's like, and now we have that. And James is like, well, how could you have known that I would become a pirate if you turned me away? And Peter tells him that a long time ago, in one of his adventures to one of the other worlds, he met the Odd Sisters. And he tells him that he gave them some of Tinkerbell's fairy dust in exchange for his shadow. I guess they had it. And that's when he learned all about how fate was already written. And he says, who am I to go against fairy stories? And he's like, don't be sad, James. He's like, we're going to have so many awesome adventures now. He's like, things are going to get real exciting around here. He says, yes. He's like, this is going to be great fun. He's like, welcome to Neverland, Captain Hook. And he flies off. So he finally got his pirate name. And if Peter wanted an adversary, that's exactly what he was going to get. And he knew exactly what he had to do. And that was kill Peter Pan. Now back to Cersei. Cersei and Lucinda were talking to each other through their magic mirrors. And Lucinda asks Cersei, she's like, did you tell James the truth? Did you tell him what Neverland really is? That him and his crew never survived the battle with the Kraken? And Cersei's like, no. She's like, but I should have. She's like, that's why I was trying to get him to stay. And Lucinda laughs and she's like, yep, just like it's written. But it's all tangled, isn't it? All these stories tied up. She's like, one couldn't happen without the other. And thanks to you, Hook is now the cowardly pirate he was meant to be, the eternal plaything of Peter Pan, lost forever in Neverland. The end. I thought this was a cute one. I really liked how finally we got back to, you know, the Odd Sisters and that storyline, even more so than the previous book. I think the lesson in this one was to be careful what you wish for. And my only question is, why didn't the sleeping draft work on Peter Pan? But other than that, a lot of the questions from the series are starting to get wrapped up. We only have one more book in the series. It's the Hades book, which we'll be doing next. If you're interested in reading this book, I will put the Amazon link in the description. It's not an affiliate link, I just put it there for your convenience. Also, if there is a book that you would like me to do a summary on while I do my makeup, let me know in the comments. It can be any kind of book. I do any kind of book, you know, within reason. If you liked this video, let me know by giving it a like. It's how I know what kind of videos I should be making, and it lets me know you care. Make sure and subscribe and hit the notifications bell so that you won't miss another fairy tale. Got one more in this series. We're almost there. And remember, be careful what you wish for. And I will see you in the next one. Bye. The Odd Sisters also say, shall we say? And Cersei's like, oh, this is our grandfather, Sir, why can't I talk? He's like, I've wanted nothing more my entire life. And Cersei kind of, damn it. Then Lucinda notices the red captain. Then Lucinda notices the red captain's coat that Hook, nope. If you're interested in reading this book, I will link the also, you don't need to stop texting me. Make sure and subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you won't let that